The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like machinery that never slept. Katie Rodriguez had stopped hearing that sound years ago, somewhere between her first shift at Sacred Heart and the morning she realized nobody in the pediatric ICU had ever asked her first name. She moved through the corridors of the hospital with the kind of invisibility that came from being competent without drawing attention, the way she'd learned to move through markets in Tikrit 2 decades earlier. Nobody remembered the quiet ones. Nobody needed to. Her scrubs were 3 sizes too large. The name badge clipped to her collar read simply Rodriguez, RN, with no title, no credentials, no sense of who had come before this uniform. There was a reason for that. There was always a reason. At 5:48 a.m., Katie pushed through the glass doors of the pediatric ICU with a cup of black coffee that had gone lukewarm somewhere between the parking garage and the third-floor stairwell. She didn't take the elevators. Elevators meant small spaces with other staff members, and Katie had learned in week 2 of employment that eating lunch alone was preferable to the kind of conversation that required remembering cover stories. The coffee tasted like burnt rubber and regret, which was exactly what she expected from a hospital machine. The unit sprawled across the eastern wing, 8 beds separated by curtains that didn't quite reach the ceiling, so sound traveled like shrapnel through the space. Monitors beeped in a rhythm that wasn't quite musical. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something warmer underneath, the human smell of fear and illness and parents who hadn't slept in days. Katie had learned to separate those smells the way others learned to separate clinical presentations from emotional noise. Professionalism meant compartmentalizing. That was a lesson that had transferred cleanly from one uniform to another. In bed 3, 8-year-old Marcus Williams slept with the kind of peaceful stillness that only belonged to children who didn't know yet that the world could break them. His monitors showed stable vitals, his breathing easy, his recovery arc exactly what the pediatricians predicted. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would change anything. Katie had already worked 3 shifts before the Bennett ambulance arrived at 6:13 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. The call came through from the ER at 5:58. Drowning victim. 10 years old. Male. Comatose. ETA for minutes. The words came over the overhead speaker like they always did, clinical, brief, devoid of the fact that somewhere in this hospital a child was about to become the center of every decision a family would make for the rest of their lives. Katie was hanging fresh saline when the transport team wheeled Marcus Bennett through the doors of the ICU. He was small. That was always the first shock. Katie had learned to expect it, to anticipate it, but the visual contradiction between the complexity of his injuries and the fragility of his form never quite resolved. The nurses from transport gave the handoff in clipped sentences. 14-year-old drowning victim. Freshwater. Time submerged estimated at 8 to 12 minutes. CPR initiated at scene. Full code in the ER for 43 minutes. Return of spontaneous circulation at code 42. Currently sedated and paralyzed. Intubated. Propofol and cisatracurium. Core temperature 31.4 degrees Celsius. Moderate cerebral edema. Pupil response sluggish but present bilaterally. Katie listened from the corner of the bay, hand steady, eyes moving between Marcus's face and his monitors. She didn't introduce herself. That would have been premature. She just watched as the transport team transferred him to the hospital bed with the kind of mechanical precision that came from having done it hundreds of times, and she waited for the next set of orders. The parents arrived 8 minutes later. Admiral James Bennett moved through the pediatric ICU the way he probably moved through naval operations, with the kind of authority that made the space around him contract and reshape itself to accommodate his presence. He was tall, the kind of tall that suggested generations of people had never had to bend for him. His dress uniform was already immaculate at 6:22 in the morning, which meant he'd already spent the night in it, which meant he'd already been awake long enough to understand that his son might not wake up again. His wife held his hand like she was trying to physically prevent something from being taken from her, and Katie recognized that grip immediately. She'd seen it in Tikrit too. Loss looked the same in every language. He was only in the water for minutes, Mrs. Bennett was saying, her voice fractured in a way that suggested she'd already said this 1,000 times and would say it 1,000 more. 12 minutes. Less than that. He's strong. He swims competitively. He knows water safety. The brain doesn't distinguish between fresh and salt water in terms of damage, a voice said. Dr. Hargrove had arrived at Marcus's bedside, and Katie felt the familiar compression of air that happened when certain people entered rooms. He was the medical director of the pediatric ICU, which meant he had spent the last 7 years building a hierarchy that depended on the implicit agreement that his judgment was the only judgment that mattered. He was competent, Katie had never disputed that. Competence and arrogance were not mutually exclusive. What matters now is intervention. Aggressive intervention. We're going to need imaging. What are we looking at? Admiral Bennett asked. His voice was different from his wife's. Controlled. Strategic. The voice of someone who had learned to separate information from emotion. Katie recognized that too. Cerebral edema. Possible aspiration pneumonia. We'll know more once we have the CT. What I can tell you now is that these first 72 hours are critical. If there's no significant neurological improvement by day 4 or 5, we need to have a conversation about goals of care. Katie didn't move. She was checking the 4 lines, adjusting the flow rate on the propofol, documenting the transfer vitals in her notebook. No one needed to know that she was listening. No one ever suspected the quiet nurse at the edge of the room. That was the advantage of being invisible. Over the next 14 days, 10 different doctors rotated through Marcus Bennett's room. They came and checked his pupils. They ordered new imaging. They adjusted sedation parameters and reviewed laboratory values. They shook their heads in that particular way that doctors shook their heads when probabilities became statistics and hope became a medical liability. Neurological prognosis guarded. Possible vegetative state. Long-term care facility. Organ donation consideration once the family was ready. Each doctor said the same things. Each doctor recommended the same outcomes. Each doctor left the same weight in the room when they departed. Katie watched them all and said nothing. On day 3, Marcus's intracranial pressure climbed to 28 millimeters of mercury, critically high. On day 7, it dropped to 16. On day 10, his left pupil reacted more quickly than it had on day 9. Not dramatically. Not enough for any of the rotating physicians to note it in the official record. Not enough for anyone to mention during rounds. But enough for Katie to see it, enough for her to document it in her personal notes, enough for her to understand that the consensus in the medical literature about pediatric drowning victims was not being applied with particular care to this specific 10-year-old boy. On the morning of day 12, Katie was changing Marcus's central line dressing when she noticed his pupils had shifted again. The response time was faster. His intracranial pressure had normalized to 14. His sedation was scheduled to be reduced later that afternoon, which meant they would know more about his neurological status within hours. She was wrapping fresh gauze around the port when she made the decision that would change everything. At 1:38 p.m., during the shift change when the ICU had that particular quality of controlled chaos, nurses passing off patients, doctors between rounds, families stepping out for lunch, Katie found Dr. Hargrove in the physician's work area. He was reviewing a chart, his reading glasses positioned in that particular way that suggested he was both reading and thinking about something else entirely. His title plate said Dr. Marcus Hargrove, Medical Director. His presence said he had never once questioned his own judgment. "Doctor, could I speak with you for a moment?" Katie kept her voice low. Respectful. The kind of voice that understood hierarchy and accepted it. He looked up. The expression that crossed his face was one of mild irritation, the look of a man being interrupted by someone he hadn't classified as important. It's shift change. Whatever it is can wait for. It's about the Bennett patient in bed 5. The drowning victim. Hargrove set down his pen. What about him? His intracranial pressure has normalized. His pupils are more responsive. His core temperature is stable. He's a candidate for sedation reduction in 3 hours. I think we should wait before discussing withdrawal of care. I think we should give him another week. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happened when someone who wasn't supposed to speak had just made an observation. Katie felt it stretch across the work surface between them. She kept her hand steady. She kept her breathing even. She did not look away. His prognosis is guarded at best, Hargrove said finally. 10 doctors have reviewed his case. 10 doctors have recommended discussing goals of care with the family. I'm not going to be the physician who gives the Bennetts false hope by suggesting a child who has shown minimal improvement over 2 weeks is suddenly going to wake up and walk out of here. I'm not suggesting that. Then what are you suggesting? Katie took one breath. Measured. 1 more week. That's all. Before we recommend any decisions. Hargrove removed his reading glasses. He set them on the chart with a kind of deliberate precision that suggested he was placing them very carefully to avoid throwing them. You're a nurse. You check vital signs. You manage medications. You comfort families. You do not interpret prognosis. You do not override physician judgment. And you certainly do not approach the medical director with revisionist assessments of cases that have already been determined by a consensus of senior staff. I understand. Do you? Because it sounds like you're playing doctor. And what that does, Ms. Rodriguez, is it confuses grieving families with false hope. It undermines the care team. It interferes with the natural process of acceptance. He picked his glasses back up. He put them back on his face. This conversation is finished. If I hear about you discussing the Bennett prognosis with the family, or with any other staff member, or if I discover you've been spending extra time at his bedside because you've decided his case is worth your personal medical crusade, we're going to have a different conversation. One that involves administration. Understood? Yes, doctor. Good. Now leave. Your shift is over. Katie turned and walked out of the work area. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She didn't tell him about the pupil response or the ICP readings or the subtle shift in Marcus's neurological arc that every single one of those 10 doctors had missed because they were looking for catastrophic failure instead of the fragile mathematics of recovery. She just walked back to her locker, changed out of her scrubs, put on the jacket she'd worn since arriving at Sacred Heart 18 months ago, an old navy surplus peacoat with the insignia removed, the kind of jacket that looked like it belonged to no one in particular, and clipped her locker shut. 1 breath. Measured. That was how she'd learned to survive the things that broke other people. 1 breath at a time. 1 shift at a time. 1 quiet moment of competence followed by another. As she walked through the hospital lobby toward the parking garage, her hand found the pocket of her jacket. There was something there, something she checked without thinking, the way some people checked for their phone or their keys. Worn leather. Metal corners worn smooth from years of handling. She didn't take it out. She just felt it there, just confirmed it existed, and then she let her hand fall back to her side. Some things were meant to stay hidden. Morning rounds at Sacred Heart began like they always did, Dr. Hargrove moving through the pediatric ICU at 6:16 a.m. with his entourage trailing behind him like courtiers following a king. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that same sickly pallor that made everyone look half dead before they actually were. Katie had already been at Marcus Bennett's bedside for 3 hours, checking his pupil response at regular intervals, noting the subtle shift in his intracranial pressure readings that the other nurses dismissed as equipment fluctuation. She knew better. She felt it the way she used to feel pressure changes in a combat zone, a shift in the air itself, a knowing that existed below conscious thought. Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the hallway before his shoes reached the threshold. Morning rounds. Everyone present. He didn't look at Katie. That was intentional. She'd noticed he never looked directly at her anymore, not since she'd asked him, privately, respectfully, for 1 more week before the Bennetts made their final decision. His ego had registered it as a challenge. His position had registered it as a threat. Admiral James Bennett stood at his son's bedside, his uniform pressed with the kind of precision that came from 42 years of military discipline. Mrs. Bennett sat in the vinyl chair, her hands gripping a cold cup of coffee that had been full 12 hours ago. Their faces had the particular hollow look of parents watching their child disappear incrementally, the face of people who had been told 10 different times by 10 different doctors that hoping was cruel, that accepting was merciful, that letting go was the only honest choice left. Hargrove pulled up the chart. His eyes scanned the vital signs with the disinterest of someone checking a grocery receipt. "No change," he announced. "Prognosis remains grave. I would recommend the family continue to consider the conversation we've had about quality of life." He turned slightly, and that's when his gaze landed on Katie. Not on her eyes. On her hands, which were adjusting markers for lying with the kind of precision that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. "Some staff members," he continued, his voice taking on the particular timbre reserved for public correction, "seemed to be encouraging unrealistic expectations." The words hung there like a smell nobody wanted to acknowledge. Nurses who play doctor confuse grieving families with false hope. "It's unethical. It's cruel." He said it loudly enough that 2 nurses from the adjacent unit looked up. Loudly enough that the resident standing behind him shifted uncomfortably. Loudly enough that Admiral Bennett's jaw tightened, not in anger at Katie, but in the way of a man recognizing a power play when he saw one. "Our job is to provide comfort, not fantasy." Katie's hands didn't stop moving. She checked Marcus's dressing, replaced his water pitcher, adjusted the bed 1 degree lower. Her face remained the same, attentive, professional, present. Inside, something older and harder registered the insult and filed it away in a category of things that no longer had the power to touch her. 1 measured breath. That was all she allowed herself. Her eyes met Hargrove's for exactly 2 seconds, and in that time she delivered her response with the kind of calm that made the Admiral lean forward slightly. "I've seen children survive worse than this, Doctor." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's steady wheeze. Hargrove's face reddened. He hadn't expected her to speak at all. He'd expected her to nod, accept the humiliation, retreat into the proper subservience that his hierarchy demanded. Instead, she'd answered him like an equal. Worse, she'd answered him like someone who actually knew something he didn't. His fingers tightened on the clipboard. "We'll discuss this in private, Rodriguez." The next morning, Katie arrived at 5:38 a.m. to find a formal written warning posted on the unit's public board. Not slipped under her locker. Not delivered in an office. Posted for every staff member, every visiting family, every chaplain and resident to see as they passed through. The language was precise enough to be weaponized, exceeding scope of practice and undermining physician recommendations. Patient expectations being set inappropriately by non-medical personnel. Recommend immediate corrective action and performance monitoring. The thing about public humiliation is that it's not about the words. It's about the witness. It's about everyone else reading it and understanding the message: this person has been marked. Don't sit with her. Don't trust her. Don't defend her. Katie read it once, committed every word to memory, and then went to the break room at 6:12 a.m. to get her coffee. The room felt different the moment she pushed through the door. 3 nurses were there: Chen, Morrison, and Reeves, all of them good people who'd smiled at her in passing, who'd asked how her shift was going, who'd shared the small kindnesses that made 12-hour nights survivable. They were gathered around the counter, their voices trailing into silence as she entered. Katie moved to the coffee maker. She didn't acknowledge them. She'd learned a long time ago that acknowledgement was a request, and requests could be denied. Chen looked at Morrison. Morrison looked at the floor. Reeves gathered her yogurt and her spoon. And then, in a coordinated movement that might have been unplanned but sure didn't feel that way, they relocated to the far table by the window. Their chairs scraped the linoleum in the sequence of people executing a decision that had already been made. No eye contact. No words. Just the clear message: we cannot be seen near you. Katie poured her coffee. The smell rose as bitter steam, burnt edges and the particular staleness that came from a pot that had been heating for 4 hours. She sat at the table where she'd always sat today. She drank her coffee. She didn't look toward the window. Somewhere in her peripheral vision, Chen leaned toward Morrison and said something too quiet to hear, and all three of them kept their focus exactly away from her. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the physical demand of restraint, the effort of keeping her hands still, her breathing level, her face neutral while every survival instinct that had kept her alive in a combat zone 20 years ago was screaming that she'd been isolated by the pack. That this was how it started. That she should move. That she should fight. She finished her coffee. She placed the cup in the sink. She walked back out to Marcus's room at 6:38 a.m. and didn't let a single thing show on her face. But that wasn't the worst part. By day 4, Hargrove had escalated into territory that moved beyond public humiliation into something far more calculated. 2 board members appeared at Sacred Heart with laminated badges and clipboards. They called it a routine quality observation, but there was nothing routine about the way they followed Katie from room to room, watching her chart entries, observing her medication administration, taking notes on every micro decision she made. The implication was clear: we are looking for something. We will find it. They stood outside Marcus's room for 43 minutes, timing her vital sign checks, counting her steps, measuring her interactions with the Bennetts. On day 5, an outside consultant arrived from Harris County Medical Review Board, a man named Dr. Pearson who specialized in protocol deviation investigation. His job was to go through Katie's charting for the past 2 weeks and find any deviation from standard procedures that could justify her removal. He sat in the medical records office with a magnifying glass and a highlighter, pulling files, comparing her notes to hospital protocol, looking for anything, even a comma in the wrong place, that could be used as evidence. Hargrove had made phone calls. Katie didn't know to whom, not initially. But she understood the mechanics of institutional destruction well enough to recognize it when she saw it. On day 6, he'd contacted the staffing agency that had placed her 2 years ago, the agency that had hired her with minimal questions, no background check deeper than a cursory criminal record search, no real verification of her credentials because she'd provided exactly what they asked for and nothing more. The agency had exactly 3 names on their referral list, and Hargrove had called all 3. What he'd found was what he expected: a woman who appeared from nowhere with vague credentials, who'd taken a job well below her skill level, who kept her distance from everyone and never volunteered information about her background. Who had scars on her hands that didn't match a standard nursing school graduation. Who moved in certain situations like she'd been trained to move in ways that hospitals didn't train people to move. The pieces didn't add up. Which meant they could be made to add up to anything. By day 7, the pressure was calculated and comprehensive. The board members were still appearing during her shifts. Dr. Pearson had found 3 minor charting errors from 2024, a date written as 04/13 instead of 4/13, a vital sign recorded before the actual time stamp, a medication notation that should have included PO designation. Nothing harmful. Nothing that had affected patient care. Everything technically against protocol. Hargrove was building a case. Not out of genuine concern for hospital standards, Sacred Heart had far worse charting violations happening in the oncology department every single day. But out of something simpler and more dangerous, the need to prove that a nurse who'd questioned his authority was fundamentally unqualified to question anything. Katie knew this because she'd seen similar mechanics deployed before, though the weapons were different. Back then it had been weapons inspections and surprise room checks and reassignments designed to isolate. Here it was performance reviews and protocol violation tallies and the slow accumulation of evidence that would eventually give institutional cover for the removal of someone who'd become inconvenient. She kept showing up. She kept checking Marcus's pupils at regular intervals. She kept noting the improvements that nobody else seemed to see, the slow uptick in his intracranial pressure during certain hours that suggested neural activity, the subtle shifts in his pupil response that indicated someone was still home inside that broken body. She kept her composure because that was what you did when you were the only person who believed in something and everyone else had already decided on the ending. Admiral Bennett noticed. On day 8, as Katie was leaving her shift at 6:22 a.m., he caught her in the hallway. He didn't speak. He just nodded, the kind of nod that meant he understood what was happening and that he'd been watching long enough to know that whatever Hargrove was doing had nothing to do with protocol violations. Katie nodded back. She didn't allow herself hope. Hope was dangerous. But she allowed herself this, the knowledge that at least one person in this building saw her. That mattered more than she wanted it to. What she didn't know was what was about to arrive during the night shift. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm through Marcus's small room. Katie checked the monitors at 2:22 a.m., pulse oximetry steady at 94, heart rate holding around 80. She was moving toward the door when something changed. A sound. Not the alarm. Something underneath. A muffled quality to the heartbeat, like the speaker on the monitor was damaged. She turned back. Marcus's chest rose and fell with the machine's cycle, but his color was wrong. Dusky. Not the pink she'd been coaxing back for 16 days. His neck veins were distended, standing out like ropes against his skin. His blood pressure climbed across the screen. 120. 130. 140. Then it didn't climb anymore. It fell. 130. 120. 110. Katie moved without deciding to move. The crash cart was 30 feet away. She needed it in 12. She crossed the room like a woman operating on muscle memory older than this hospital, older than her nursing credentials, muscle memory that had learned triage protocol in a field hospital outside Tikrit when she was 31 years old and someone's daughter's life depended on her hands working instead of her mind calculating fear. Cardiac tamponade. Blood in the pericardial sac compressing the heart. Killing him in minutes. She grabbed the crash cart and rolled it back into Marcus's room. The monitor showed 88 systolic now. 72. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. Katie. A night shift resident, Dr. Chen, appeared in the doorway, young enough that her voice still carried questions at the end of statements. What's happening? Acute distress. Muffled heart sounds. Probable tamponade. She was already moving, not asking permission, not explaining. Just stating facts. Get Hargrove. Now. Dr. Chen's face went blank. I'll call. Get him. I'll manage here. Katie prepared the pericardiocentesis tray with movements that felt like a conversation between her hands and something older than conscious thought. Spinal needle. A 20 milliliter syringe. She'd done this before, not in a pediatric ICU, but in a concrete building in Iraq with rounds coming through the walls and a 14-year-old boy whose lungs were filling with blood because a shrapnel fragment had found his chest. The procedure was the same. The stakes were the same. The time window was the same, roughly 4 minutes before the heart stopped altogether. She prepped Marcus's skin with chlorhexidine. The smell of it took her back, not to Tikrit but to the 1,000 smaller moments between the big ones, the routine rituals that kept you moving when your mind was screaming. She found the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her fingers knew where it was. They'd always known. Senior Chief Rodriguez. Medication push. 1 milligram epinephrine, for push. The words came out. She didn't hear herself speak them. She heard them the way someone heard their own voice on a recording, like it belonged to someone else, someone who'd been trained by the Naval Medical Corps to speak like this in exactly these circumstances. She advanced the needle. Steady pressure. The pericardium was dense, resistant. She pushed through it. The syringe met blood immediately, dark, venous, the color of pooled life, and she drew back. 60 milliliters. The pressure released. The room suddenly got quieter, not because the sound changed but because the machine's desperate tone softened. The mechanical wheeze found its rhythm again. Oxygen saturation climbing. 68. Dr. Chen was reading the monitor now, her voice climbing. 72. 79. 85. 90. 92. It's stable. Katie, it's stable. Katie kept the needle in place, kept drawing. The heart sac was decompressing. The pressure around Marcus's heart was releasing. She could feel it in the resistance changing against her hand, feel the difference between dead tissue and living tissue finding room to function again. Sinus rhythm, she said quietly. Normal perfusion returning. How did you? Dr. Chen stopped. She was staring at Katie's hands. At the way they moved, at the absolute absence of hesitation, at the precision of someone who'd done this when lives depended on it being done exactly right. Who trained you to? The door opened. Hargrove. In scrubs, hair uncombed, but fully awake. He took one step into the room and his face completed a journey from confusion to horror to something Katie recognized from her own mirror on bad days, the moment a man realized his version of the world had shifted without permission. Call cardiothoracic. Tell them we may need a cath lab. Katie was withdrawing the needle, securing the site with a pressure dressing, her voice steady as a surgeon's. Echocardiogram as soon as the equipment is free. I want cardiac monitoring continuous, no breaks, next 12 hours. Nurse Rodriguez. Hargrove's voice had a quality like ice under pressure. Step away from that patient. She stepped away. The monitors showed Marcus's oxygen saturation holding at 94. His heart rate settling into a normal range. His blood pressure climbing steadily back toward acceptable. The numbers that 10 different doctors had watched decline for 16 days were climbing again. Hargrove moved to the bedside and checked the monitors himself. He checked the 4 lines. He checked Marcus's pupils, his peripheral perfusion. He was looking for evidence that what he was seeing wasn't real. The evidence wasn't there. Marcus Bennett's vital signs were stable. Improving. Moving toward survival by every metric that mattered. Security, Hargrove said, without looking away from the monitors. I'm calling security. 2 uniformed guards arrived in 4 minutes. Hargrove spoke to them with his back to Katie, his words clipped and precise. Something about scope of practice. Something about unsupervised procedures. Something about immediate suspension pending investigation. Katie didn't argue. She'd learned in this hospital, learned in exactly 16 days, that arguing created a narrative. Silence created mystery. Silence made people wonder what they didn't understand about you. And in this case, what they didn't understand was everything that mattered. She hung up her badge at the nurse's station and walked to the parking lot at 2:51 a.m. The Houston humidity was thick enough to drink, and somewhere in that darkness was a single apartment and a 9-year-old daughter who would wake up in 4.5 hours wondering why the coffee wasn't brewing, why Mom was crying at the kitchen table at 6:30 in the morning, why the words Mommy got in trouble at work meant something that made grown women unable to speak. What they didn't know was that she'd walked away from a Navy career to find exactly this, a place where nobody asked questions, where she could be just another nurse with steady hands and a quiet manner, where the ghosts from Tikrit might finally stop walking behind her at night. And she'd blown it. By saving a 10-year-old boy's life. By refusing to let him die because 10 doctors had decided it was impossible. By using skills that were supposed to stay buried forever, locked in a part of her that she'd spent 20 years teaching herself to ignore. The suspension notice was waiting for her in the administrative office at 6:22 a.m., before the morning shift officially started. Effective immediately, pending investigation. Unauthorized medical intervention. Exceeding scope of practice. Dr. Hargrove had already signed off. The director of nursing, a woman named Patricia who'd known Katie for 2 years without ever really knowing her, slid the paperwork across the desk with genuine sympathy in her eyes, the kind of sympathy that made everything worse. You saved his life, Patricia said quietly. Everyone knows you saved that boy's life. Katie took the envelope without reading it. The words were already burned into her vision. She'd known this was coming. The moment Hargrove walked into that room with security, she'd known. But knowing and facing it were different territories. You can fight this, Patricia continued. We can file a grievance. The hospital has Good Samaritan provisions. If you had performed that procedure and he'd coded. I didn't fight in Tikrit, Katie said, her voice steady as a metronome. I won't fight this either. The words escaped before she could stop them. Patricia's pen froze mid-air. Katie stood. She was wearing scrubs from yesterday, the emergency pericardiocentesis kit still faintly visible in the pocket lining. She'd rinsed it twice, but the muscle memory of the procedure lived in the fabric. 60 milliliters of blood. The spinal needle sliding through pericardium. Marcus's oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 94 in 90 seconds. Sinus rhythm. The monitors sang it. The room went dead silent. And then Hargrove came through the door with security like she'd expected, like she'd somehow summoned him with the sheer gravity of what she'd done. I'll need your badge, Patricia said. Katie removed it from her lanyard. The photo was 2 years old. A woman in scrubs with cautious eyes. Not quite a lie, but not the whole truth either. She'd gotten good at that, the partial truth. The strategic silence. The drive home took 18 minutes. The Houston traffic moved like scar tissue, stiff and unyielding. She sat at a red light on Richmond Avenue, watching pedestrians navigate the sidewalk without knowing anything about Katie Rodriguez except that she existed in the margins of their day. She preferred it that way. Preferred the invisibility. Preferred a life where no one asked questions, where her past stayed locked behind a door she'd welded shut 20 years ago when PTSD became less of a diagnosis and more of a permanent roommate, the kind that woke her at 3 a.m. with phantom helicopter sounds and left her gripping the bathroom sink, hyperventilating into her own reflection. She'd walked away from the Navy because staying meant drowning in a dress uniform. Nobody knew that. Not her ex-husband, who'd left thinking she'd just lost interest in being married. Not her daughter, who was 9 years old and thought Mom worked at a hospital that sometimes needed her to stay overnight, nothing more mysterious than that. Not the other nurses at Sacred Heart, who'd accepted her quiet presence the way you accept elevator music, ambient, functional, not requiring acknowledgement. Now that door was open. She pulled into the driveway of the house she'd rented for 5 years, a small craftsman-style place with a porch swing and a mailbox painted the color of faded hospital gowns. The morning was already humid, the way Houston mornings are in August, like the atmosphere itself is sweating. She sat in the parked car for 4 minutes before going inside, her hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the adhesive residue from the medical tape that had held Marcus's monitoring leads. The sensation of taking a life's vitals was never really clean. It clung. Inside, the house smelled like the overnight oatmeal she'd prepped 3 days ago and the ghost of coffee she'd made at 5 a.m. She moved through the kitchen like a woman walking through someone else's memory. The kitchen table sat near the window that overlooked the small backyard where she'd planted tomatoes last spring. They died. She hadn't known how to save them either. She sat at the table and opened her laptop to check the hospital's personnel system. The suspension was already posted in the employee portal. Effective immediately. A formal investigation would follow. Expected timeline, 14 to 21 business days. She read it twice, then closed the lid and put her forehead against the cool aluminum edge. At 1:22 p.m., she heard the front door open and then close, a sound like the world exhaling. Her daughter's voice came down the hallway with the particular confused pitch of a 9-year-old who'd been released from school early for an administrator training day that suddenly didn't exist. Sophie had a key. Katie had given it to her 2 years ago, a responsibility that felt enormous and fragile, like handing someone a bird made of glass. Mom. Sophie appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her backpack slung over one shoulder, a uniform cardigan wrinkled from the school day. Why are you home? Katie looked at her daughter and felt something fracture inside her chest. Sophie's face was the only mirror she owned that told the truth. This child had Katie's mouth, Katie's dark eyes, Katie's way of tilting her head when she was trying to solve a puzzle. She was a living, breathing collection of everything Katie had survived to protect. Come here, Katie said, but her voice cracked at the end, and that was when the tears started. They came without permission, without the measured dignity Katie had perfected over decades. They just came, hot and saltwater and completely outside the boundaries of her composure. She was crying at 1:22 p.m. on a Wednesday, at her kitchen table, in front of her daughter, and she couldn't stop it. Sophie dropped her backpack and crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, reaching for Katie's face the way children do when they're trying to understand an adult's breakdown, as if crying were a symptom that could be treated with proximity. "Mom? Are you sick?" "No, baby." Katie's voice was wreckage. "I'm not sick." "Did someone die?" The specificity of the question undid her further. Of course Sophie would ask that. Hospitals were the place where people died. It was the only death Sophie's 9-year-old mind could connect to her mother's job. "No." Katie pulled her daughter close, breathing in the smell of playground dirt and the coconut conditioner from the school's bathroom. "No one died." But something had. Her carefully constructed silence. The year and a half of living as someone other than who she was. The anonymity she'd fought so hard to build, brick by brick, breath by breath. All of it was collapsing like a sand castle in the minutes before the tide came in. She couldn't tell Sophie the truth. Couldn't explain that her mother was suspended from the hospital pending an investigation. Couldn't explain that she'd performed emergency surgery without authorization because the alternative was watching a 10-year-old boy die while 10 doctors stood around agreeing it was the right call. Couldn't explain that she had a serial number tattooed on her collarbone, covered by scrubs and shame and a deliberate choice to become someone small enough to hide. Sophie sat in Katie's lap, too old for it really, at 9, but still willing, and Katie held her there, one hand on the back of her daughter's head, the other gripping the edge of the kitchen table like it was the only solid thing left in her life. The afternoon light moved across the floor in a way that felt like measurement. Time passing. Her life dividing into before and after this moment. The rain started at 2:38 p.m., tropical and sudden, the kind of Houston rain that sounds like the sky is being poured out. It hit the windows with enough force to make Sophie flinch. "Can I stay home tomorrow?" Sophie asked. Katie couldn't answer. The words were too big. So she kissed the top of her daughter's head and held her while the rain hammered the windows, and somewhere in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder, came the sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the Houston humidity. Katie's head lifted. That sound. She knew that sound. The UH-60 Blackhawk's distinctive two-blade chop, the way it split the air like something primal announcing its presence. She'd heard it 1,000 times in memory, in dreams, in the parking garage of Sacred Heart when medevac runs came in at 3 a.m. But this one was different. This one sounded like it was landing at Sacred Heart. "Stay here," Katie whispered to Sophie, and she stood, moving to the window as the sound grew louder, more insistent, the rotor wash pushing against the house like a physical force. The helicopter rotors grew louder. The windows rattled. Katie's hand pressed against the glass as the aircraft descended toward the helipad 3 blocks from her kitchen, close enough that she could see the military markings through the rain. She didn't move. Didn't call out to Sophie again. She stood there and watched her hidden life arrive in the form of a UH-60M Blackhawk with Navy insignia blazing across its fuselage. The aircraft touched down. The rotors didn't stop. Someone would be walking through that hospital in minutes. Someone would be asking questions. Someone would find the answer standing in pediatric ICU with Marcus Bennett's file in her hands and a suspension notice taped to her employee record. By the time Katie arrived back at Sacred Heart, the lobby was already shifting. Word had spread through the grapevine, military personnel in the hallways, federal credentials flashing at the front desk, questions being asked about a nurse named Katie Rodriguez and a chart with her handwriting on every note. The morning shift staff scattered like birds sensing a storm. Dr. Hargrove was nowhere to be found. Katie moved through the corridors with her badge clipped and her voice neutral when anyone spoke to her. She was technically suspended. She shouldn't be here. But nobody stopped her, and she didn't ask permission. In pediatric ICU, Marcus was awake. His mother was holding his hand. His father, Admiral James Bennett, stood at the window with his arms crossed, watching the rain. That's when the new patient arrived. The nurses wheeled him in on a gurney, and Katie was reaching for his chart when she heard the man's voice. Accented English. Familiar in a way that made her breath catch. He turned his head to look at her, and his eyes widened. Senior Chief Rodriguez. His voice cracked like an instrument played in the wrong key. You are the one. From Tikrit. You held my brother as he died. I remember your face. Katie's hands didn't move. The chart stayed in her grip. She looked at the man on the gurney, late 30s, military bearing despite the illness, a name on his intake that said Zahir Habib, refugee status, asylum pending. She had held a lot of people as they died. She had held a lot of hands in the dark outside the wire. But she remembered this one. She remembered the brother's name. Tariq. 19 years old. Bleeding out from shrapnel wounds that no amount of pressure could stop. I remember, Katie said quietly. Admiral Bennett's head turned. He stepped out of Marcus's room and into the hallway where Katie stood, where Zahir's voice had just echoed from the new admission. The Admiral's eyes narrowed as he looked at the man on the gurney, then back at Katie. His expression shifted like a lock finding its key. You know him, the Admiral said. Not a question. From before, Katie replied. For words. That's all she gave him. But that wasn't all anyone needed. A Navy SEAL team leader was visiting another patient 2 doors down, chest wound, 3 weeks into recovery. He'd heard the voices. Heard the name. Heard the recognition in Zahir's broken English. He stepped into the hallway with the kind of presence that made hospital staff unconsciously take a step back. Broad-shouldered. Scarred. The kind of man who'd seen the edges of the world and survived them. He looked at Katie. Really looked at her. Then his voice cut through the corridor like a command. 2 bronze stars. His words landed like stones in water. 1 with Valor device. Navy Commendation Medal. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. The hallway went still. The fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz louder in the silence. The SEAL's eyes moved across the assembled staff, 3 nurses frozen with medicine cups in their hands, a resident physician staring, the charge nurse's mouth slightly open. You were 3rd Battalion attached to JSOC Task Force 121, the SEAL continued. His voice carried the weight of someone speaking into a record. Tikrit. 2004 through 2007. 3 deployments. You held half that command together when everything else was falling apart. Katie set the chart down on the counter. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't confirm or deny. She simply turned and began walking toward the elevator, but the SEAL wasn't finished. Nobody was finished. An FBI agent was waiting by the elevator doors. Dark suit. Badge on his belt. The kind of federal presence that doesn't announce itself until it's already made its conclusions. He'd been investigating Katie Rodriguez's credentialing for 2 weeks, brought in by Dr. Hargrove's complaint, tasked with reviewing her qualifications, her background, her right to practice. He'd been investigating the wrong person the entire time. Dr. Hargrove forged entries in your personnel file, the agent said. His voice was flat. Official. We found the originals. Different computer terminal. Different timestamp. He was building a termination case. The man committed federal fraud to bury you. Katie stopped. She turned to face the agent. Her jaw was tight, but her eyes were steady. Where is he? Lobby, the agent replied. About to be taken into custody. She walked down the hallway with the SEAL team leader beside her, with Admiral Bennett following, with the echo of Zahir's voice still hanging in the pediatric ICU behind them. They moved through the stairwell, down 2 flights, out into the lobby where the rain hammered the glass doors and the world outside looked like the end of something. Dr. Hargrove was standing near the information desk, his suit jacket rumpled, his face the color of old bone. Federal officers, 2 of them, broad and silent, stood on either side. One of them was already holding handcuffs. Dr. Stephen Hargrove, The first officer announced, "You're under arrest for falsification of federal employment records, obstruction of medical practice, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You have the right to remain silent." The words continued, but Hargrove wasn't hearing them anymore. His eyes found Katie standing at the base of the stairs. He saw the SEAL team leader. He saw Admiral Bennett in his navy dress blues. Where had those come from? How long had Bennett been here? His face went through stages of recognition, then panic, then something worse. Something that looked like the moment a man realizes he's spent months building a case against someone with an entire branch of the military behind her. The handcuffs clicked into place. The officers turned him toward the exit. The hospital staff, nurses, orderlies, residents, custodial workers, parted like water. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The rain outside drummed its rhythm, and a man who'd built his career on authority and hierarchy was walked past his subordinates in restraints. 6 months later, Katie learned the rest. Hargrove lost his medical license. The state board revoked it in an emergency session. The hospital's legal team settled with Zahir for assault of a federal refugee. And Dr. Stephen Hargrove, age 58, with 32 years of medical credentials and a reputation built in conference rooms and hierarchies, now taught CPR to high school students at a community college 40 minutes outside Houston. The name tag on his polo shirt read, Steve. When anyone called him doctor, he flinched. Hard. Like the word was a trigger he'd never disarm. But for Katie, the real moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in the break room, the same break room where the other nurses used to leave when she sat down, restocking the refrigerator with her lunch when she found something in her locker. A pair of combat boots. Old. Worn. The leather creased in 1,000 places. The laces knotted in the way soldiers knot them when they plan to wear them for years without taking them off. A note was tucked inside the left boot. Handwritten. Navy blue ink on cream paper. 8 weeks after 10 doctors told the Bennett family to let their son die, Marcus walked out of Sacred Heart on his own 2 feet. No wheelchair. No assistance. Just a 10-year-old boy with his mother's hand in one of his and his father, a full admiral in the United States Navy, holding the other, walking past the pediatric ICU where Katie Rodriguez was checking another patient's vitals. Marcus stopped. He looked at her. He didn't know what she'd done. Didn't know about the pericardiocentesis or the suspension or the federal investigation. But Admiral Bennett nodded to her. A small gesture. The kind of acknowledgement that passes between warriors who've both survived impossible things. Katie's hand steadied as she adjusted the 4 flow rate. She didn't flinch. Didn't tremble. The trembling, if there had been any, was restraint. Pure, measured restraint, the kind that comes from someone who'd held a boy in Tikrit as he died, and now watched his brother live. The boots stayed in her locker. She wore them on weekends, walking through the Houston humidity with a stepdaughter who finally understood why Mom had those kind of hands. Why she moved the way she moved. Why some people's quiet contained entire wars. She was offered the position of Chief of Trauma Services. She declined. She wanted to stay in scrubs. She wanted to keep checking vitals and catching the things 10 doctors missed. She wanted to be the person in the room when everyone else had stopped believing. The hospital added a new wing 6 months later. The James Bennett Veterans Trauma Center. Pro bono care for service members and their families. Katie Rodriguez stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony in dress blues, her actual ones, not borrowed authority, and when the administrator asked her to give remarks, she looked out at the crowd and said 5 words. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. The rain started again as she walked to her car. Her daughter, Sophie, 9 years old, finally understanding, held an umbrella over her mother's head. Katie reached down and squeezed her hand. They didn't talk about Tikrit. They didn't talk about the boots or the admiral or the man in handcuffs being walked through the lobby. They just walked together, and that was enough. Have you ever judged someone by their job title and been catastrophically wrong? Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'm curious, comment below and tell us if you're watching this alone or with family. Now let's see how this unfolds.